Thanks to all the thanks to all the familiar faces who are joining our webinar here to listen to these young researchers. So it's my pleasure to introduce the three of them, and then they'll each have their opportunity to present their research, and then I'll ask some hopefully probing questions and open up to the audience as well. So first of all, we have Christina Bouchard, who teaches Ascendant Perspectives and Multi-Level Governance at the University of Ottawa. Her doctoral research centers around how governments within Canada manage land, plan infrastructure, and how the instruments of Canada's planning regime enable or constrain democracy. Her master's is from Dalhousie University. We have Anna Soer, who's a PhD candidate at the University of Ottawa in political science. Her research focuses on renewable energy development in Nunavut and Greenland, and she also looks at corporate social responsibility and community consultation within the wider environment social governance framework. And her master's is from Radboud University in the Netherlands. And last but not least, we have Tate Williams, who's a recent addition to the Nadsen Research Fellow team. He's interested in critical security and political economy in the Arctic and is currently a graduate student in the Department of Political Science at Colorado State University in Fort Collins, Colorado. So as you guys know, I'm very interested in energy and infrastructure in the Arctic and very much looking forward to how this next generation of scholars is perceiving it and what your insights are. So without any further ado, Christina, we'll get started with you.
Thanks very much, Heather. I'm just going to quickly share my presentation here. There we go. There we are. So thanks very much for having me. As Heather mentioned, I'm interested in planning regimes. And specifically today, I'm going to be mostly focused on Ontario. I think our threshold is 10 to 15 minutes, so not quite enough time to touch on all the nuances about the differences between the provinces. But certainly there's been a lot of activity in Ontario and a lot of reforms to the planning regimes here in Ontario. So I guess what I'd like to say just at the beginning, at the onset, is that there is an appetite, there's a desire to try and develop the North. And indeed, if we look at the development levels in Northern Canada and compare them to other parts of the world, there's unquestionably a deficit in the infrastructure that has been developed here in Canada. What I would like to do is, as we have these conversations, is to try and ground them a little bit in terms of thinking about our democratic systems that we have, and in terms of the role of municipalities specifically. A lot of conversations about the need for infrastructure are very top heavy, they're very statist, and they draw upon policy concepts that sort of hope that merely by naming the policy goals, this will be the thing that will lead to implementation. And what I'd like to argue is that currently we're in a system where we need to go a little bit deeper than that. Currently, the regime of implementation that exists in Canada is a culmination of 40 years of what was named by Christopher Hood as New Public Management back in the 1980s. And there's a number of different dimensions to that, sort of basically moving away from the Keynesianism in the post-war period, where there was a lot of government direct intervention in the economy and investing in infrastructure projects. In fact, it created the infrastructure base, much of it, that we now enjoy today. Many of these assets were built in that period, just following World War II, the 60s and the 70s. In the 1980s, there was a contraction. And there was a widely held view that a new approach was needed because things were too centralized and it was becoming too cumbersome. And so there has been a very strong decentralization movement in terms of who is performing implementation work and regulatory work, how, when, and why. And so this has really shifted things in an interesting way, because although the Canadian Constitution states that municipalities are nothing more than followers, policy takers of the provinces. In actual reality, in terms of boots on the ground and people doing frontline work, there is a lot of judgment that is being exercised in a more context-sensitive way by local governments. And so it brings us to very fundamental questions that I feel quite strongly are under-theorized in the Canadian context in terms of what can and should be said at these higher levels of values by senior governments, and how it is that implementation is actually performed, and how we can exercise that in an appropriate way through the regional jurisdiction of provinces, and in a more granular way once you get down, right down to the community level. And something that's really quite interesting is that as we consider these tensions, right, of moments in which the big vision of infrastructure, right, the need for something to work as a larger system across provinces and across the country may actually benefit from more centralized attempts to plan by senior governments, when that's a good thing and when it's strong and when we should try and bring it back a little bit, versus when you need that granularity, when you need to ensure that voices are not left behind and democratic values are being upheld. So what I'm going to argue for is that as we approach these questions, we must keep in the forefront of our minds the need for both input legitimacy, which is an effort to design our systems in appropriate ways at different levels, and output legitimacy, which is what you get at the end. The pictures showed here are a public consultation about a library, right? A library that could have different rooms for different purposes. It could serve the community in different ways. It's an opportunity in the process of building an asset to talk about all of these options with the people who we want to serve. The other picture is people actually using it. And output legitimacy is a very fundamental question. What you get at the end being something that is desirable for the community, maybe even for those who did not participate in the public consultation. So two related but separate issues. Now moving on to some of the mechanics a little bit. So every province creates municipalities. They will have acts legislated to be able to do the work of planning. So it gives them some delegated authority there. And one particularly important thing that municipalities are instructed to do in Ontario is create official plans. So official plans can contain policies that the local councils approve, and usually quite a bit of consultation goes into developing the substance of official plans. They, as an instrument, are an incredibly important form of control over territory. They will include things like zoning, for example, and so will dictate within a particular local political jurisdiction areas that can be industrial, areas that must be only residential, areas that can be commercial, and so on and so forth. And so, from the standpoint of getting things done, what we need is an integrated approach where people are really literate about what exists on the ground in different communities to ensure that everyone is on the same page and we're able to be organized throughout the planning process and integrate new pieces if they come in midstream, in between the time horizons of usually about 10 years or so that these things are reviewed and renewed and so on and so forth. Another very important tool, environmental assessment acts. So basically this is a legislated codified way in which studies are done. And in the French literature, they say la porteur des valeurs, the carrier of values. And indeed, both in the case of official plans and environmental assessment studies, specifically how they're used and what they are understood to be as instruments of the planning regime, they really do reflect public values. Official plans in their introductory statements, they'll always say things to the effect of the main goal being economic development, right? So it's sort of this fait accompli, the idea that we are developing. It's just specifically how, specifically where, specifically who. What are the regulations that we use to either deny or enable? And it's the same thing with environmental assessment studies. Incredibly, back when I was working as a planner, they were requiring environmental assessment studies just to put in short sections of, painted bike lane, incredibly, in downtown Toronto. So in that way, they're really being used as a system of control, as a barrier to get it done. It wasn't a form of over-regulation in that circumstance. And incredibly, at the same time, environmental assessments are actually not required to open a mine in Northern Ontario, even though the consequences of doing so in certain cases can be quite serious for health and the environment and so on and so forth. So looking at things in terms of the systems that we have, in terms of the instruments that we have, they can give us some deep insights about our priority and our society, and also how to maybe fix things and make things better, right? When we understand the instruments, we understand what we like, what we don't like, and how it is that things can be advanced. So one more note I'd like to touch on is currently things, as we all know, they're going online very much, and instrumentation is becoming more and more digital. This includes the domain of planning. There's a couple of really interesting tools that are great sources of information, actually. Anyone who's keen on infrastructure and development more generally can use these tools and access them. They're readily available online. One is the Ontario Environmental Registry, which posts information about proposed changes that the province is making to legislation, regulations, policies. You can even search things by area using a map. The threshold for consultation here, I would say, is actually very low. I've done some empirical analysis of specifically what is posted by whom and how and when. And, throughout the term of this provincial government that we've had, really things are posted for the legal minimum amount of time generally, which is only 30 days. The provincial summaries of the issues are usually very brief and very accessible and very readable, not too dense, not too technical, but you can really get some great information by looking at the submissions that people make, which can be viewed by other people. So for example, you'll have interest groups from industry who will often have some very detailed things to say about certain proposals, even legislative proposals. You'll have municipal governments who will weigh in, and sometimes those people can be very expert in terms of the level of knowledge that they have about a particular jurisdiction. So it's an excellent resource there. And the second tool that I'll mention is Access Environment. And so this is, again, a digital map-based tool where you can see a number of things that do have a measure of regulation tied to them. So for example, if you're undertaking a commercial or industrial activity where you've got to register site condition or register environmental compliance, if you are going to take water, there's a permit for that, so on and so forth. Literacy of the planning systems that are in place can really help us to navigate them and to have a better grasp of how it is that we wish to move forward with some of our objectives. And so as things like, for example, the mining of critical minerals is considered as one of these sort of high-level policy objectives that a lot of people seem very keen on as we go to produce batteries, it's just relevant and important to take a context-sensitive approach and acknowledge that sometimes regulatory regimes can be a burden. Sometimes they can provide consistency and clarity and transparency and a framework within which stakeholders can productively work together over a period of time. And so I think this is really the balance to strike, is acknowledging when it is that the potential harms of not having a state acting in the public interest could actually just create a vacuum and in that vacuum cause people to go to litigation, right, is the risk. In the absence of having a clear and transparent and indeed consistent planning regime, what happens? Well, people, they sue each other, they turn to the courts. So I think I'm up on my time, so I'll conclude there. Basically, as we approach, planning, as we approach consultation, as we approach, working with people, it needs to be done in good faith. It needs to acknowledge what has come before, and the systems that we have in place must acknowledge all of the precedent that has been set in given areas. It is not enough to work in silos. We need to recognize at every level of government the context that we're working in, the historical context that we're working in, and how it is that we can make things better in the future.
Great, very good, Christina, well presented, very impressed. Maybe I'll just ask one softball question before we move on to the other presenters. I'm very fascinated by the question of capacity. You mentioned, there's that balance to be had kind of between what I took as, kind of the efficiency and the democracy of the process. And in the north, this is very much compounded, where the population is very diverse, very dispersed also, and there is a lot of decentralization, but capacity is uneven, in some of these technical issues. Where do you see the issue of capacity? Does it that affect the extent to which you decentralize, or do you decentralize and then try to improve the capacity, or how do you view that issue of trying to grow capacity to make sure these things are done ably?
That's really very, very, very interesting. And, I think the best answer that I can give is that it will be easiest to work with people about the things that they care about, and the things that will benefit them, and the things that will impact them in a positive way. So if we're talking about capacity building, to do with shelter, clean drinking water, this type of development, I think that it will be a positive thing to work with stakeholders and have good conversations there. Again, I can't take people's voices, but this is my impression. Where it gets a bit trickier is around questions of resource exploitation and ownership, where maybe the links between the benefits to the local community are a bit less direct and a bit less apparent, right? So I think this is a balance to be struck in terms of how, there's a southern influence on the north, how much of the development that we're doing is around, bridging gaps in basic subsistence infrastructure that is needed for some of these areas where we are far behind compared to a number of other, northern nations, and how much of it is roads to resources, in the classic sort of like Diefenbaker vision of we're just gonna, send trucks up there, take it all back to another place for processing. If you are too far on one side, right, this just propagates colonial histories that I think are very traumatic for people. And so we really need to, I think, in our efforts to undertake planning as a state, be aware of what the needs of the communities are and balance that against the desires, the economic desires that we may have that's driving narratives about other types of infrastructure. I hope that answers your question.
Does that and more. Thank you, Christina. So now we'll move over to Anna and move over to, I think, more to the energy side of things. Not roads to resources, but certainly some interesting case studies to be found in Nunavut and Greenland, if that's what you're focusing on, Anna. So I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, thank you. Let me share. Oh dear. 1 second, my computer decided to not work. Sorry about that. My computer had a moment of despair. There you go.
Worries.
Up, and then first of all, let's start maybe at the beginning. That would be great. And there you go.
Perfect.
And let me put you in a little bit. There you go. Oh, sorry about that. So thank you very much, Heather, and thank you for Nazan for this opportunity to present my work, well, some of my work. The title of this presentation for today is Renewable Energy, Fossil Fuels in Nunavut, Beyond Oppositional Narratives. So it's a little bit different than the title that I proposed, because I think that this title, Oppositional Narratives, maybe reflects what the presentation is going to be more about. The pictures, so most of the presentation is going to be pictures based on fieldwork, and I will get back to that, as well as prior research that I did for a book chapter on a similar topic. So this is the abstract. I won't go over the abstract. This is just in case someone would like to receive the presentation after. Feel free to shoot me an email. So like I mentioned, this presentation is in part the result of fieldwork that I've conducted in April this year in Iqaluit, Nunavut, where I attended the mining symposium, as well as conducted in-person and virtual semi-structured and unstructured interviews with civilians, public sector representatives, civil society representatives, and private sector representatives. So the state of energy in Nunavut. So these pictures, the reason why I chose these pictures is so to kind of show in graphics, to show in reality for daily people on the ground what energy actually looks like, truly, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of the physical objects, what is energy about? So the territory of Nunavut, while it does not have crude oil or natural gas production, it is estimated, according to the government itself, that crude oil resources range from 18 to 267 billion barrels of oil and 182, and I quote, 1,228 trillion cubic feet of gas. So the federal government makes estimates that is more about the 18 billion barrels of oil and 180 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. So renewable energy development has been slow, mainly to two types of challenges that I will come back to later. One of technological nature, which also includes surveys, and another is of capacity, so from maintenance to also adequate public policies. So to go back to the slide and to these pictures, what does energy mean for Nunavut, for actual people, not just people in offices, but simply the average Joe in the streets? So on this side, I don't know if you can see my cursor, you can see the beach gas bar, which I found absolutely amazing. An abandoned building right in front of the harbor, the picture that you can see on the bottom, and that supplied gas as well as operated as a bar, which amazing combination. That is right in front of a harbor where boats and skidoos rely on fuel to work, which in turn is essential for food safety. Energy is also warmth, is everything that permits people to live in their homes, to survive in their homes, from heating to electricity. Energy is also how people move around, is their vehicles. So when we are looking at, for instance, oh, I would like to go hunting, or I would like to go just explore, just walk around the lands, well, in order to do that, you need to have reliable vehicles. So fuel is also your ability to simply exist on the land. Overall, the dependency on fossil fuels is, it seems from these pictures, to be almost complete. There wouldn't be life possible in Iqaluit and in Nunavut without fossil fuels. And yet, while that is true, renewables are also everywhere. And people underground also talk about renewables all the time. So here to go over the pictures, This on the corner in the top is one of the very few private homes of Nunavut. We're talking about 7 in total that has private solar panels on their home. On the bottom, right underneath that private house, this is Iqaluit greenhouse. And as you can see right next to it, there's solar panels. The picture in the middle is the power plant of Iqaluit on the top of the hill. The power plant that has quite a large solar panel. And the one thing that I also find quite amazing is this generator that if you squint, I'm sorry, my phone camera was not exactly up to par here, but if you squint really hard, you can see that this generator also has solar panels. So interviewees, all of the interviewees that I talked to, specifically the civilians, wish that there was more investment, sure, but what most people emphasized was the wish on more education. Even for the few homeowners, they wish it was simpler to have access to renewables. And I was not that, and I quote, complicated with Kulik, the federal government grants, and receiving audits. Overall, just that things could be a little simpler. The one topic that truly made the news and that everybody was very, very eager to talk to me about was a cabin program where you can install solar panels on your cabin. Everybody I've talked to not only supports this program, but would like to see it develop much more. What is crucially missing, however, is literacy. Understanding how energy systems work, what they can offer and what they can't offer, as well as who is developing what and where and when, is still today a little bit wonky despite massive improvements and real efforts by the many actors, which I will get back to. So when we're talking about oppositional narratives, there is a tendency to separate this reality from that reality. Whereas when we see, as expected, that the reality is so much more nuanced, that renewables and fossil fuels, and I will go back to that in my conclusion, are not portrayed, are not necessarily truly the enemies that they're portrayed to be in development when we're talking about energy safety and energy security in Nunavut. So to come to a topic that Christina also mentioned, I promise there is a reason why there is a picture of pads. Truly, I promise. So all involved actors, private actors and public actors, say that they are conducting proper community consultation. So as expected, right? They wouldn't say, oh no, actually we're doing a very bad job. Of course not. They're saying, yes, we are conducting proper community consultation. However, when I talk to civilians, to the average Joe, several interviewees highlight the lack of proper community information communication and wish that the government, oftentimes the responsible actor that the interview civilians refer back to is oftentimes the government. It's unclear to them oftentimes which private actor does what, but the government is the one responsible either way. At least that is the message that is vehiculated oftentimes, is the government. The government needs to do this more. So they wish that the government did more to develop renewable energies. So on community consultation, I think it's quite important to also mention the larger context on how energy can also become a crux that also has a short-term historical legacy, especially since the moratorium of 2019 on offshore oil and gas exploration and exploitation, which was very contentious. I will come back to this in the next slide, between, on the one hand, some local elected official that said that it wasn't going far enough, whereas higher level elected officials that said that this was just colonial imposition. So it was a very contentious topic. However, what that moratorium says and how it looks today in 2024 in practice shows that community consultation on energy is a fast evolving practice. It's also entering mainstream practices as well as policies. But while that is also true, there's some gaps and room for improvement. So while that is said, why the pad picture? How are pads linked to the energy debate? So I wanted to show this image to put the conversation on energy back in its larger economic context for the daily lives of Iqalumiut. Building energy diversity and resilience, the need for development is so that a box of 40 pads doesn't cost almost $40 anymore. That's $1 per pad. For those that don't know, in the South, 40 pads do not cost $40. This is what the cost of living is about, and this is also what priorities are about. When food is 5 times more expensive in the North and the South, when the government is the largest employer in the territory, and where boxes of necessary goods like pads are unaffordable for families, the discussion on energy cannot come at the price of people's lives. This is what the just transition is about. The discussion on the energy transition cannot be separate from the discussion around justice in this transition. It's not only a systemic and whataboutism conversation on who pollutes the most, it's about recognizing people's needs, priorities, and how to best incorporate people's interests and priorities into effective policies. So like I mentioned, there are many, many actors involved in this energy debate, in this energy sector in general. While I was starting my field work, some people, either directly or indirectly, shared with me how quite a few hunters were considered hydro to be a big concern due to its potential impact on the narwhal, a very sensitive animal, and yet also a very crucial animal. What that example shows is that not every energy solution is a solution for every context. This is also what energy diversification means, right? So while that may seem to be self-explanatory and quite evident, is not always how it is not only communicated to local communities, it's also not sometimes how it is advocated by some of the private sector actors. So the actors involved in the energy sector are many, which adds complexity for efficient communication when turnover is high. Who does what? That high turnover and a low retention rate also means that it oftentimes ends up that people are working in silos, despite some improvement in the last few years, especially by the Climate Change Secretariat, to bring people together to talk at the same table. So Sanikiluaq, just to name an example, is a case that has captured media interest as a case study for the difficulty in implementing renewable energy solutions in Nunavut from a policy perspective. The company in charge, NNC, conducted a survey in 2017 to see the wind potential. The results were, unsurprisingly, promising. Natural Resources Canada is investing $6.5 million out of the $13 million for the wind turbine array. With a proposed 10 small-scale turbines and battery energy storage, the project is set to displace 50% of the diesel used on an annual basis for community electricity generation. The project is shaped through a regional community ownership model for which the mayor of Sanikiluaq voices support. However, the project is taking longer to implement in part due to difficult administration and communication between the different involved actors, between a change in government and additional time to review the project according to ministerial standards. The implementation of the Independent Power Producers Program by Kulik Energy Corporation will allow the diversification of energy production from renewable sources to then sell it to QEC to generate electricity. The implementation has slowed down the development of the project in Sanikiluaq, where even though the IPP project came into effect in September 2022, that's extremely, extremely recent. So overall, when talking about political will, it's important to avoid, however, the pitfalls of either personal allegations or fate-like resignation. Addressing policy and political decision-making also come through policy making, truly sitting at the table, the physical act of sitting at the table to make a policy, which itself is a result of good governance. And that term of good governance that appears very often is a can of worms in and of itself. So as a conclusion, the mediatization of the supposed dichotomy between oil and renewables hides a much more nuanced reality, and it also hides discussions that people on the ground, that daily people, the average Joe has regarding both their relationship to oil and their relationship to renewables. Because of that, oil and renewables are solutions to they're offered as solutions to different problems. This is what energy security, so both diversification and redundancy, environmental preservation and subsistence, from economy to food security, are also about. And that, in and of itself, is not a unique challenge. It is not unique in the world. Iqaluit or Nunavut is not the only place in the world that faces this rising tension or this development of both oil and renewables at the same time. These are challenges that are experienced by many communities worldwide. So yeah, this is what I wanted my presentation to be about, to perhaps center discussions around the average Joe, to center discussions around the people that are going to be on the receiving end of all those big policies, of all those big discussions that can sometimes happen thousands of kilometers away, for instance, in Ottawa. So yeah, thank you so much. I will stop the share.